With the sun high overhead, Jesus rested upon a shady rock. As the crowd of townsfolk grew quiet, a skeptical rabbi, an expert in Jewish law, questioned Jesus. "Teacher, what should I do to live an eternal life with God?" Jesus turned the question back on the rabbi. "What do the scriptures tell you?" "Teacher, the law tells us to love the Lord with all of our being and to love our neighbor as naturally as we love ourselves." Jesus said, "Yes, obey this and you will live forever with God." Hoping to demonstrate his mastery of the law, the rabbi said, "But can you tell us who exactly is our neighbor?" And Jesus told a story. Once there was a man, and he was on the dangerous journey from Jerusalem to Jericho. You know how narrow and perilous this way is to travelers. It was growing dark, and on a remote stretch of the rocky path, the man was attacked. Thieves who prey on isolated travelers fell upon him. They beat him, stole all his possessions, even took the clothes off his back, and left him alone to die. But a priest of God, the ones you see in the temple, was also traveling this lonely road. As he looked upon the dying man, the priest feared for his own life. Or perhaps he didn't want to get his fine clothes too dirty and passed it by him on the other side of the road without stopping to help. A short time later, a Levite, a person who also worked in the temple, came along the road. He too saw the wounded man, and blaming the man for his own carelessness, left him in a puddle of dirt and blood. A Samaritan soon came after along that dusty road. One of the very same Samaritans that you see as cursed, the same Samaritans that you despise, saw the injured man, a known enemy, and took pity on him. With a gentle hand, this Samaritan washed and bound the man's wounds. He lifted the man onto his donkey, guided him to a nearby inn, and cared for him the rest of the night. In the morning, the Samaritan took 2 precious coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Care for this man and give him anything he needs, and when I return, I promise to pay for whatever else he owes." Jesus paused. He looked at the crowd and then at the doubting rabbi. "Now I ask you, who was a neighbor to the man who was a victim?" The teacher of the law reluctantly replied, "The Samaritan, the one who showed mercy." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." Getting lots of great illustrations this morning. These are by John Hendrix, and perhaps you'll see more of his work as this series this fall about Jesus and the parables goes on. But can you tell us exactly who is our neighbor? Good question. And it's always bothered me that Jesus doesn't actually answer the question. For the second week in a row, if you happen to remember what we talked about with the parable of the seeds and the soils, Jesus is asked for an explanation, but he takes his story in a different direction. I don't think that Jesus is avoiding the question. He's just answering the more important question, the more essential question first. What does it mean to love my neighbor? How do we do that, really? As this story is perhaps the most enduring legacy of Jesus' teachings, I think you all know the answer to this one. To love your neighbor means that you pay attention to the needs right in front of you. You don't walk by, you get engaged. You do what you can, whenever you can, which is easier said than done, particularly in situations like this poor guy lying by the side of the road. My instinct in those situations like that is definitely to cross to the other side. Carrie is embarrassed to know me sometimes. But that's the primary point of the parable. Of course, it is harder to get involved. Our instinct is to go elsewhere, but do it anyway. Do whatever you can. Do not turn your head. Don't walk the other way. My neighbor needs me, and I need them. Love sees the whole, sees that my neighbor and myself are connected at a base level. So we must get involved, even when it's messy and imperfect and vulnerable. Go and do likewise. That is the way of Jesus. But that first question still lingers. Who is my neighbor? I think Jesus leaves this question hanging intentionally, allowing the parable to draw us deeper. This story could easily have been told without the ethnic identity of the helper. But as some of you have heard 100 times, the Samaritans were the enemy. Not in a military or political sense. There hadn't been actual fighting between the Jews and the Samaritans for generations. But culturally, ethnically, the Samaritans were like the dirty second cousins. They were those people from, pick your favorite geographical stereotype to push against, those people from Alberta, those from Ottawa, the ones from Regina. Come on, seriously, Jesus. This guy is the model of a good neighbor? Yes, him. The one who showed compassion, the one who helped, the Samaritan. He is the good neighbor. Go and do likewise. Eye rolls all around. But the question lingers. What would it mean to be a good neighbor? Not just be like that guy, but be a good neighbor to that guy. How do you get involved? How do you be helpful to your rival, your scapegoat, the one you despise just for being who they are? Now this is complicated. This Samaritan is not bleeding. He's not lying by the side of the road. He's actually doing quite well for himself by all accounts. He's got a donkey. He's got some spare change in his pocket. What does the Samaritan need from a neighbor? Part of me wants to say, nothing at all. He's fine, I'm fine. Let's just live and let live, the Canadian way. But on second thought, if I do take it seriously, if I do begin to engage with him as my neighbor, even if he is one of those people, well, there's the deficit. There is a deficit between us. It's not with him. It's in the way that we see each other, or at least the way that I see him. And that's not about him, that is about me. Because in my mind, in the story that I tell myself about him, he's not a neighbor, he's that neighbor. Might be the casual stereotypes, the geographic innuendo that I've been poking at, or it could sink to the level of the isms and phobias that we use to label other people's prejudices. To love my neighbor, I have to work through all of that stuff at all of the levels in myself. Whatever it takes to get to the point where I can see them as a whole person, to allow them to be who they fully are, not just a them, but an us. To love your neighbor is to learn to see your neighbor fully as they are. It doesn't mean you're going to have a deep, meaningful, mutual relationship with every neighbor that you meet, but doing this work within myself in order to make room within me for them to be whoever they are, that is what Jesus was up to. Especially among the folks with less status, less power, fewer resources than he had. I like how Father Greg Boyle puts it. Here is what we seek, a compassion that can stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. Greg Boyle works with people trapped in poverty specifically, but I think that can apply to any other. How do we stand in awe at whatever they are carrying, the burdens of their particular life, to recognize that's a lot, and I don't know the half of it. And so who am I to judge the way that they live? The same lesson that Jesus offered last week. Be curious, not judgmental. Now let's be real for a second. There is a teensy tiny bit of judgment going on in this parable, at least for me. There are villains in this story, aren't there? I give you the temple priest, boo. And the Levite, the religious scholar, boo. The outfits are different, but those kinds of people exist in our world as well. You know, the kinds of folks that make other people cringe whenever I introduce myself and say, well, I'm a pastor. No, not that kind of pastor. I've got all kinds of judgments about those Christians, especially as election season ramps up and I start to blame them for causing harm to my country, my province, my city. Deep breath. Who is my neighbor? Oh no, it's those people too. What does it mean to love the villains as I imagine them? Well, the lessons so far apply to them as well. Start with the need in front of me. Religious people, wealthy people, they have needs too. Appearances aside, nobody actually has it all. I like how this writer puts that possibility into the story. As the priest looked upon the dying man, the priest feared for his own life. Who knows? Jesus didn't say that was true, but yeah, that's legit. That's universal. Fear is a big part of my own response to crisis. Fear of what might happen to me. Fear that I might make things worse. Fear that if I get involved, I'm going to have to stay involved. Fear that I can't actually help and that will damage my self-image as a competent, keeping it together human being. That flaw in him, whatever it is, that's in me too. If I put my mind to it, I can imagine lots of legitimate reasons why the priest and the Levite don't do what I think they are supposed to do. Those kinds of Christians, those pastors that I vilify, they are real, full, complicated human beings. There are reasons why they are the way they are. They see things differently than I do because they are standing in a different place than I am. To see them as neighbor is to keep reminding myself that they too are whole people, part of this whole community, part of this whole organism that we call creation that God has named good and beloved, even with them in it. How do I cultivate curiosity? How do I even have awe for the burdens that they carry? How do I help them to address those burdens instead of looking down at them for how they are carrying them? I often don't know, but it starts with asking the question. One more neighbor in this story, most often overlooked: the bandits, the thieves, bad guys. Well, there, I'm definitely keeping my distance. Most of us are. We want nothing to do with violence. It doesn't even cross my mind to wonder about the bandits when I read this story. But there it is again. Who is my neighbor? What if it is these guys? Let's be curious. What's their story? Why are they stealing and beating up strangers on the road to Jericho? Maybe they are the cardboard bandits of old westerns, just scoundrels looking for easy money and cheap thrills. Or maybe they're desperate to feed their families. Maybe they are freedom fighters, and this is a calculated, if repulsive, way to push back against the empire. Maybe they're runaway slaves. This is their only way to stay alive. We don't know. Would any of that change anything? Maybe, maybe not. The point is, we don't know what we don't know, and if these are our neighbors as well, that suggests they are not as distant and dissimilar from me as I might like to think. They, too, are in some way part of us. And so again, we're curious. We seek to understand. We seek to see their common humanity. We seek within reasonable boundaries to move towards rather than away, to help address their problems, to preserve their dignity and build their capacity, to get involved in changing the societal conditions that push people towards a life of banditry. Because, as Jesus said, my neighbor and myself are linked, and this neighborly love links all of us to God, heart, soul, mind, and strength. Who is my neighbor? All of the above, for better and for worse. We could keep mining this parable for secondary and adjacent characters. The innkeeper who did the actual work of caring for the injured man, that's my neighbor. The donkey who carried the injured man and the Samaritan onward in their journeys, that's a neighbor. The legal expert who asked Jesus the question that sparked the story. The crowd listening to the exchange with all of their expectations and complications, and so on. But can you tell us who exactly is our neighbor? Apparently not. Apparently we have to work that one out for ourselves. The question lingers. Go and do likewise.